face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Hello and welcome to episode 17 of the Policy Dialogue series with alumni, staff, faculty, and students from the University of Maryland. The views expressed do not represent official positions of the school or alumni network. Our goal is to discuss global issues and how we can solve local, national, and international challenges. My name is Evan Papp, and I graduated from the School of Public Policy, class of 2011, with a focus on international security and economic policy. And I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab, which creates content on labor, political economy, arts, and culture. And I'm very excited to be speaking with Dr. Stacy Kosko, who is an associate research professor and associate director in the Center for International Development and Conflict Management in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. She holds a Ph.D. in public policy and development studies from the University of Maryland, where she studied development ethics under mentorship of David A. Crocker. Her research focuses on development ethics, human rights, and marginalized populations. Stacy, long time. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. How are you doing?
Yeah, I haven't seen you in so long. It's wonderful to see you again. I'm great. Thanks.
So to begin, could you talk about a bit about your background and how you first got interested in international development ethics and human rights?
Yeah, so my background is one of many different careers and majors and programs of study, and I never really expected to end up here as an academic or somebody doing international development. But I've always been passionate about social justice, and so my sort of studies in undergrad and then going on to my master's degree really focused on social justice. And when I graduated from my master's, which was in conflict management and foreign service, I started out at the Advocacy Project doing human rights work. And there was a good measure of development and conflict work. And, I kept coming up in sort of I was the deputy director of the organization, and we kept coming up against these sort of big policy issues and difficult operations questions that often had underlying some kind of big kind of moral dilemma or ways in which different human rights seem to contradict each other, where you sometimes have to, it seems, make trade-offs. And I always sort of felt like, wow, there must be somebody out there who's given a lot of thought to this and sort of it has been able to come up with frameworks and ways of thinking about these and answering these dilemmas in a way that we can justify. But I don't have the bandwidth to do that because I'm saddled with, all this email and just, ordinary operations at a small NGO. And so ultimately I decided to go back and get a PhD. And I had anticipated actually going back into the practice community and, back into human rights practice. But what I discovered when I was doing my PhD with Dave Crocker, also of University of Maryland fame, I discovered that, like, wow, there's this whole field called development ethics that I was completely unaware existed, as I think most practitioners are. And the whole kind of purpose of the field is really to give us like a sort of moral and ethical vocabulary and set of frameworks and tools for making these difficult decisions and justifying them, ethically speaking. And so, once I kind of discovered that field, I realized, like, okay, this is something I really, really want to focus on. And human rights is a big part of that. It's not that they're separate things. And so, I ultimately, by the time I finished my PhD at the School of Public Policy with Dave Crocker, realized, actually, I kind of want to keep thinking about this. And I think that my value added is in more in helping students and future human rights advocates and practitioners to think through these difficult challenges and to have that moral vocabulary and to have these frameworks at hand. And so I decided to stick around, and I'm still here.
So what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on, I don't even remember the title now, but it was on human rights in marginalized communities, and with a specific focus on education. So I was really interested in the ways in which education policy can either support or undermine human rights, particularly for marginalized groups, and particularly for groups that are marginalized because of some cultural distinction vis-a-vis the majority population. And so the two I did 3 main case studies in my dissertation. 2 of them were on Roma, Romani Gypsy, Roma communities in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe. And one of them was on the Sami, the indigenous reindeer herders in Scandinavia and Northern Russia. And I was interested in like, okay, how can we make education policy that is going to support the needs of all students, not just majority students, and in a way that we can justify from a human rights perspective.
I mean, the big concepts into the actual practice and the policy, it seems like there's just a huge gap there.
Yes.
But yeah, the recommendation, and then you bring in the financial and the economic and the politics and everything else.
Absolutely.
It becomes extremely complicated.
Absolutely.
So where do you begin though when you're trying to maybe make a change in public policy? I guess by discussing it, bringing up that there is an issue, I presume is like one of the first issues or first step.
Absolutely. I think where do you begin depends on where you sit or stand. So, you know, as somebody of relative privilege, you know, I have a sort of a voice and a platform and a microphone that a lot of other people for whom these issues are really urgent don't have. So, you know, I actually, like, just a couple of days ago, I got an email from somebody, a representative in Congress who wants to work on, you know, an agenda that's underpinned by secular moral values, and reached out to me to say like, hey, can you help us, you know, develop this moral vocabulary and the arguments that we need to forward, you know, sort of ethical policy making, but, you know, from a secular moral perspective. And I was like, yeah, great, awesome. But, you know, how many people who actually suffer the kinds of abuses and marginalization that, you know, I focused on in my dissertation, how many of those kind of people get those emails? Like none. Right? Very few. So, you know, the question is, you know, if you stand in a place of privilege and you stand in a place where you do have a kind of microphone, then you have a moral obligation to use it, and you can start with your skill set. If your skill set is, as you and I have talked about before, filmmaking, make a film. If your skill set is blogging, write a really compelling blog and make sure social media picks it up. But if you don't stand in a place of privilege and visibility, then you have a different set of options. And you know, there are lots of different ways in which public advocates aim to get their voices heard. And that was actually the subject of my Fulbright research when I spent a year in the former Soviet Republic of Moldova, and I spent the time interviewing minority youth activists, not just minority, but marginalized youth activists. So minorities, but also other marginalized groups like disabled persons and so on, and interviewed them about how they actually aim to make social and political change. And I had so many fascinating conversations, and there are so many fascinating tools at people's disposal, even when they are on the margins of society.
So a big part of it is getting the agency of the people who are affected some type of capability, which kind of brings me to my next question, since you serve as the executive board of the International Development Ethics Association, and you're a fellow and officer of the Human Development and Capability Association. So what is the capability approach?
It's a great question. There are many capabilities approaches. The one that most people have in mind, I mean, there are many versions of it, I should say. It all kind of has the same core. Founded, you know, it's sort of and articulated originally by Amartya Sen and then Martha Nussbaum, and also with Ulhak and Crocker and others. But at its core, the capability approach is a way of thinking about development. You know, Sen famously named one of his books, Development as Freedom, thinking about capabilities as freedoms, but substantive freedoms. So the idea that the capability approach wants to forward is that, or one of many ideas, is that all of us in society ought to have real opportunities to be and do what we value and have reason to value. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we are obligated to take up those opportunities, but we ought to have real opportunities. And there's 2 pieces to that make the capability approach important and distinct. So one of them is that real opportunity means it can't just be de jure, it can't just be on paper. So like saying, okay, you know, these minority youth have the right to go to school, great. But if they attempt to actually enroll in school and they're blocked by the local authorities, they're told that, well, the classrooms are all full, or if they try to attend, they get eggs thrown at them, or they're berated and abused. They don't have a real substantive opportunity to get an education, right? Just because it's on paper doesn't mean that it's real. Or if they're too poor to go to school because they don't have shoes or appropriate clothing, or they're too hungry to learn, they don't have the real opportunity for education. So what the capability approach tells us is that we need to look at all the pieces that go into making the opportunity to be educated real and substantive and an actual opportunity for people, not just an opportunity on paper. So that's one piece. Then the other piece is the bit about, nobody is required to take these up, right? So, just because it's important for all of us to have the opportunity to be well nourished doesn't mean that we are forced to be so at all times. And the great example of that Sen and others give is that there's a real difference that we need to articulate between somebody who is starving because they do not have the resources to actually be well nourished, and on the other hand, somebody who fasts for religious reasons or who is on a hunger strike in jail, right? There's a choice there. That person may have the opportunity to be well nourished, but they're choosing not to be. And it's unacceptable to put a feeding tube down their throat, right? But the person who doesn't have the opportunity, that's the person we need to focus on. And then folks can choose which of the things in sort of their opportunity set, their capability set, they want to pursue based on what they value.
So oftentimes the material realities is sometimes the foundation that a lot of people will be looking at when they're looking at capability approach. The concept of freedom is much greater circle than just the material approach. It brings in so many other factors. How do you respond when someone says, we just need to focus on the material aspects of trying to improve someone's freedom?
Right, so this is sort of like a basic needs approach to development and human rights. I respond by saying that meeting our basic needs and just our basic material or physical needs does not make for a truly human life. It's not what flourishing is, and every human being deserves the opportunity to flourish in the way that they choose, consistent with not harming others. But the ability to, and so this is where Martha Nussbaum's sort of list of basic capabilities kind of comes into play. The ability to love who we choose to love, the ability to affiliate with those we choose to affiliate with, to make human connections, to be creative, play, the ability to rest. These are things that are vital for humans and also non-human animals, actually, although we tend to think of it as a human thing. It's not. These go far beyond just sort of the very basic physical needs. What makes life worth living is not the fact of staying alive. It's the fact of all of these other wonderful things that we experience in our heads and in our hearts and in our souls. That's what makes life worth living. And when we say that all that really matters is that our basic needs are fulfilled, we're basically denying people the right to have any kind of a life beyond physical living. And that's something a lot of people would feel is not worth living. We can do a lot better than saying that, we're going to meet basic needs or do no harm. We should be striving for human flourishing and human dignity. And there's no reason why we should fall short of that from the human rights approach or development approach or public policy approach.
Beautifully said. It goes against, how do we commodify this beauty? How do we commodify this justice?
Can't we sell this?
This person's creative endeavors, how do we make money on it? So it really changes the entire question of what the whole purpose is for the meaning, I guess, of
absolutely. Being able to buy more stuff is not what makes us truly human or happy. And we know that from public policy, and we know that even from quantitative studies.
So I'm always in awe of people who've written and published books, and you wrote a book, Agency and Democracy in Development Ethics. Talk a little bit about the process of it coming to fruition and what it's about.
Yeah. Absolutely. And actually, I have it on my desk, not because I thought you were going to ask me that question, but you'll appreciate the cover art. Evan, you recognize that?
Yes, the guys in Morocco.
That's right.
Side note to the audience,
the
we
market
did
in Fez.
a winter abroad trip to Morocco and saw a bunch of beautiful cities and part of the University of Maryland.
That's right. Yeah, and it was started by Dave Crocker at the School of Public Policy. Yeah, so Evan and I were there together when I took that picture. The book has its origins in my work with Dave Crocker. So Laurie Kelleher, who's my co-editor in the book, was also a student of Dave Crocker's. She was a philosophy student, but he was on her panel. In fact, we had 3 of the same 5 committee members. And so Dave Crocker founded in the 80s in 1984, the International Development Ethics Association. And when we had the 30th anniversary, we started talking about, so we had a big conference, an anniversary conference in Costa Rica, which is where it was originally founded, which is why we pronounce it IDEA and not IDEA. And we started talking about, like, how can we honor the legacy of Dave, who is coming up on his retirement from the School of Public Policy, and then also the work that IDEA has generated over many years and many scholars. And Laurie and I said, Dave really needs a festschrift, a celebration work of his life's achievements, because he has done so much. I mean, he's probably the most important living development ethicist in the world right now. And so, that sort of was the birth of the idea. And we started reaching out to people who are, longtime collaborators of his, former students of his, other sort of giants in the field. And we were delighted, but not surprised at how many really amazing scholars were like, yes, I will write an essay to celebrate Dave Crocker's work. And so the essays in the book, and Laurie and I each have one in there as well of our own, they're not about Crocker. They're inspired by or somehow engaged the issue areas that he has done so much to forward, especially the agency aspects of international development ethics, and democracy, democratization, and public deliberation. And so, folks wrote these essays, and then we insisted that Dr. Crocker take up the opportunity to respond to them in the end. And of course, he came back to us with a 70-page chapter. We're like, okay, the editor's not going to like this. Can we make it 2 chapters, divide it in half? So he has 2 conclusion chapters, and they're outstanding. And he in fact makes some real pivots from some of his previous work in this book, and sort of says, actually, I'm coming around on certain issues, including some things that Stacy and Laurie have been, jabbing me about for a bunch of years. And we're just really pleased with it. And the people who contributed were so generous and did really amazing work. I would love for people to take a look at it. It should be coming out in hard copies, and paperback soon. In the meantime, it's a bit on the expensive side because it's a hard copy from an academic press, but I can always share chapters, as asked.
Awesome. And I also agree, David Crocker is just a very great person, and he's very open to dialogue, and he's changed a lot of lives, I think, by doing some of the winter abroad trips that I know you were also very much a part of in administering logistics and speaking French to a lot of people who don't speak.
Yes, translating over yes. I have some clear memories of a lot of adrenaline with some very talkative Moroccans, yeah.
So one of your newest projects, you aim to create an online open access development project design toolkit. What is that?
So this it comes from several different places and work that I've done teaching and also practicing international development. But the idea is that there are all of these tools out there that those of us who are responsible for designing development projects, development interventions, tools that we have at our disposal to help us design better. more effective, more efficient, with better monitoring and evaluation, better problem analysis, better stakeholder analysis. We have a set of tools, and oftentimes these are put together in project development manuals, internal documents that organizations and agencies use for their staff to help professionalize the work that they do. So the American Red Cross has one that I use in my class. I helped write one for the Porteous Family Foundation. UNDP has one. There's a lot of them. But the work that I've done with practitioners around the world, and the work that I've done with my students with them, has made me realize that a lot of folks who are doing really important community-based development work don't have access to these tools, or are unaware that these manuals exist. And so that was sort of one of the insights, that there's a need to give people sort of free, open access opportunity to discover and use these tools to help them design better projects that are going to be better candidates for the funding that they need for their communities. The other insight is that even the toolkits that we have here in the US and Western Europe and elsewhere, that we have these manuals at our disposal, there's nothing about ethics in them. Development ethics has no place in there. And, there's certain insights in there that, of course, we can say, are consistent with a development ethics mindset, stakeholder analysis that focuses on the marginalized, for example. But the tools also miss a lot of opportunity to bring development ethics in, not just kind of at the end stage. You're like, hey, are we like screwing anybody over here? Should we check on, I don't know, should we do a gender analysis at the end or something? Rather, it can be built in at every stage of the design process. And so what I aim to do with this toolkit is to create a set of, open access tools that can be accessed anywhere in the world where somebody has an internet connection. And ultimately, I hope it'll be something that people can download with just a phone, that will allow them not only to create sort of more effective and efficient programs, but to do so with the insights and imperatives of development ethics right at the core of each stage of the design process. So that's the goal. Whether we can accomplish that, I have no idea. We're working on it. We're a year and a half in. And I have a FIRE stream, which is FIRE is the first year innovation and research experience program at the University of Maryland. So I have 40 undergrads and an assistant professor who are working on this, which is really exciting. And it's fun to be able to share it with them and sort of their discoveries as well. So that's one of my current projects.
So to go off a little bit on a tangent,
Yeah.
I spent 10 years in international development, and
Yes.
so many times when these projects are being designed, they oftentimes don't even consider the monitoring evaluation until the very end, which is
Right.
absurd to try to measure your actual impact. But there's another really pervasive dynamic of power within these organizations where the majority of the work is being done by the people in the country, by the host country nationals.
Mm-hmm.
And you go to an embassy or a U.S. agency for international development office, and it's going to be 70% local staff.
Rightly so. Yeah.
Have very limited actual control, power in designing a lot of these mechanisms. And then at the same time, the people who are ultimately supposed to benefit from it at the very end point of the communities, they oftentimes have no say in it. And they should, in some ways, I almost want a Yelp for the communities targeted by these projects to rate them afterwards, to really show that maybe we should be thinking the design process a little bit more holistically, because there's so many different projects that are needed, but are just really poorly thought through. So I really appreciate your work on this.
Thank you.
Everyone
I agree fully. I mean, a more holistic and integrated and horizontal process is really important. And one of the insights that I think is really important from Dennis Goulet's work. He's sort of the father of development ethics and a big inspiration for Crocker, who's continued his work. one of his big insights is that, the point at which the non-elite, we can call them the beneficiaries, whatever he calls them, the non-elite, the point at which they enter the process is a really important factor in our determining whether or not this is a good or a high quality process. And so, he asks, like, all right, are people are the beneficiaries or the non-elite entering in kind of only at the very end to say, like, yeah, that worked for me, or it didn't? Are they entering in at some point when the project is already designed and they get the opportunity to sort of say, I'm on board or I'm not on board? Or are they involved right from the beginning, even at the problem identification stage? Like, what do you see in your community that seems important to you? What would you like to see changed? What is alarming? So, the sooner in the process that we involve people in the communities that we intend to impact, whether they're abroad or, right here in our own backyard, sort of very often, the better the process will be.
Absolutely. So I want to shift a little bit as we talk about your work as a professor. How has it been teaching during the pandemic? I'm sure it's been a very challenging year.
Yes, I mean, I also have homeschooling children, so that adds an extra dimension to it. It's hard. I think I was more prepared than some because I, for quite a while now, have been teaching global classroom courses, which are courses that where I bring my class together with another class from another university. I've done it with Tel Aviv and several times now with Leiden University, and a professor there, and we co-teach all of our students together synchronously online all semester. And so I think because I'd had that experience of yes, I had my own students in the classroom in that moment, but I also had half of my students, looking at me through a screen. I think that helped me to be more prepared with the technology, and also with some of the ways, the do's and don'ts of trying to engage people in an online environment. With that said, it still bites, if I can say that in this podcast. It's the human connection that I really appreciate in my teaching, and that I think helps us to focus on what one another are actually saying and to hear each other. It's much harder to achieve that through a screen. So my students have been awesome. They've adapted beautifully, they're engaged, but it's not quite the same for any of us. And we also all just have Zoom fatigue. Like, it's exhausting. We get tired of looking at screens. Our fitness bands are yelling at us to get out of the chair, like just, walk down the hallway, anything. And that's really, really challenging.
And the students too. I mean, I can't imagine what their experience being anything other than just being challenging and negative, and being isolated in the dorms. You can't go outside, or you can't interact with fellow cohort.
That's really hard.
I'm sure it's really tough.
Well, so this actually goes right back to what we were saying earlier about what makes life worth living, right? Human connection is part of that, and being able to connect with the humans we want to connect with without being stopped, whether it's by a pandemic or by hostile members of our community or some religious imperative or a government or anything else. Like, being able to affiliate and interact and have meaningful relationships with other human beings. We are biologically evolved to be social animals. And to make those connections, that's what makes us survive. We literally cannot survive. I mean, the neurology even of human connection is fascinating. And so when you shut that down, that just generates so much stress. Even though students might have said, and professors, pre-pandemic, like, I just want to sit around in my bed in my pajamas and, like, go to class on Zoom. That was fun for a couple weeks. And, now we're all pretty well aware of how much we miss that connection.
So I also want to talk a little bit about labor relations in higher education, and the fact that right now, at least in primary and secondary school, we're having this huge argument that teachers and teacher unions are the enemy of students, even though they're the ones who care more than anyone else, spending their time outside of work, spending their own money on materials. They want to be in the classroom more than anyone because they understand the power of that in-person classroom teaching, and being over Zoom is actually much more work in a lot of ways.
Right.
So the spotlight on higher education hasn't been hasn't been shared quite as much, but there is a growing concern about the unequal labor relations between tenured professors and the rest of the teaching staff. So what has your experience been, and what are some ways that we could ensure that people going into teaching in higher education are treated and compensated equitably? And that's a huge issue that
how long do we have?
on
I thought you were going to ask me about teachers at the primary and secondary level, because they're working their butts off, and they're underpaid for people who are meant to be creating the citizens of the future. Yeah, so what you're really getting at is the distinction between three classes, and they really are classes at the university level, of teachers and faculty and staff. So there's tenured and tenure line professors. There's professional track faculty. So they're still in the faculty category, but they're professional track. And then there's staff who function often as faculty members, but in the HR side, they're classified as staff. And the PTK faculty, and also very significantly teaching staff, are widely seen, not by everybody, but by the institution and by many members of the institution, as not being quite equal to tenure line faculty. And this is a problem not just at UMD, but throughout higher ed, everywhere in the country. It is true that the tenure system is under fire, and that's scary for a bunch of reasons. And I get that. And there are a bunch of reasons why it's under fire. There's a business imperative there that I won't get into. But the universities treat non-tenure line faculty as somehow other, even when we have identical job descriptions. And so our salaries are lower. Sometimes our benefits are fewer. I had to fight for parental leave to be in my contract when I got my first contract at UMD, because they were like, well, you don't really need, and I was like, no, yeah, I do. I want that in my contract. And of course they gave it to me, but I shouldn't have had to fight for that. But if you go, for example, to a faculty ombuds person, and say like, hey, my salary is way lower than others in my department, for example, they do say, well, you are not a tenure line professor, so you can't really argue that you're the same. And if you're not the same, you can't argue that you're underpaid or that you're being discriminated against. And that's troubling. And there are a lot of people who get very frustrated by that. With that said, my department is really on a mission now to erase those differences. They're really being great and kind of going out of their way. Our new chair is going out of his way to really address some of those inequities. And I'm very happy and grateful for that. It's not happening everywhere on campus though. And a lot of people who are who are non-tenure line faculty and PTK and teaching staff get really frustrated by the sort of, the class system. And that's difficult. And as long as that persists, to answer your question more directly, then recruiting and hiring and keeping those faculty members is going to continue to be hard. Now, with that said, there are very few tenure line positions anywhere in the country. At UMD, for example, 3/4 of all undergraduate courses are taught by PTK faculty and teaching staff, not by tenure line professors. There's just so many more of us than there are of others. So often we don't have anywhere else to go, but it's still hard. And some people who do have alternatives might bounce, and those people can be really valuable. PTK faculty tend to be in the most high touch positions, meaning that the most direct interaction with students, in the most kind of intensive environments, and to the extent to which Maryland cares about teaching its students, including its undergrads, which it does, that should be something they should address. So it's working on it. There's Faculty Affairs has a position that's dedicated to addressing some of these issues, but universities are quite literally medieval institutions, and they have changed very little since their establishment in medieval Europe. And so fighting that system is hard. It's really hard. It's very entrenched, and a lot of people get frightened by those changes because they wonder, well, what happens to me? What happens next? So I think the UMD is taking a lot of the right steps, but yeah, it's going to be a long slog.
And just one follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any organizing efforts amongst the 75% that hold the power to withhold their labor?
Right. So there are initiatives on campus for PTK faculty to come together. There's a conference or colloquium that happens once a year, which is meant to be an opportunity for PTK faculty to share their work, both research and teaching, and to sort of, it's a showcase of, the contributions of PTK faculty on campus. It also often ends up being sort of a mutual venting session. It's like group therapy. That happened to you too? Oh my God, what did you do? But there is no sort of separate union. There's no union at all that I'm aware of, actually, for teaching staff and PTK faculty. So yeah, that organizing aspect is important. I think a lot of us, and this is true, I think, of people in any kind of unionizing situation, there's a lot of concern that, like, well, if I withhold my labor, where do I go next? Because one of the problems is that, and again, this is common in a lot of labor situations, and this is why the tenure system is very different, but tenure line faculty can't be fired unless they essentially abuse somebody. But our contracts are at the pleasure of the department. They can be terminated without cause at any time. And there are so many PhDs being minted every day that there will always be somebody else ready to step into that vacancy. Because PhD programs are minting multiple, like many-fold more PhDs than there will ever be tenure line positions for in academia. So that fear is real, and I know that's something that plagues unionizing, always, and strikes and whatnot. But yeah, it's true for us too.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm sure it's a big struggle, and hopefully things will change as we understand the importance of higher education, in the most hard-nosed, to be competitive in the global world type thing, but also to build the capability of the adult citizens of this country, and to
absolutely
that it's not just this for-profit, but it's actually, there's something else there that's important. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I also recognize that, even though my position is sort of within an inequitable system, I still occupy a position of real privilege. And I do love my job. I genuinely do. So, that fight is there, but let's put our efforts on the people who are in much more vulnerable positions as me is a good place to start.
So in closing, looking into the future of development ethics and human rights, where do you see opportunity and hope?
Everywhere. Humanity is getting better, even if it's hard to see. And, as Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And if we take a long view, it really, really, really is changing for the better. We often focus in the West, especially on the sort of civil and political rights, liberties, as we call them here in the US. And so we can look around and say, well, these are under fire in lots of places. There's so much backsliding everywhere in civil and political rights. And that's true to a certain extent, but we don't focus enough on what's changing with economic, social, and cultural rights. And we have been making enormous strides. I mean, we halved absolute poverty within the 10 years of the Millennium Development Goals. That's an extraordinary feat. We've slashed infant mortality in the world in just the course of not even a full course of primary education. That's extraordinary. But when we think of human rights, we're often not thinking about the economic and social rights that are really part and parcel of what makes our lives go well. Not to say that civil and political rights don't also help make our lives go well, but we often focus only kind of on one class of human rights. And if we take the wide angle lens, we can see that the world is getting better. And there are places where it's getting worse, and there always will be, but on a whole, we're getting better. Development ethics as a field, you know, outside of academia and even within academia, a lot of people don't know that it exists, but a lot of people are doing the work anyway. And increasingly, a lot of people are recognizing, like, hang on, we need a moral vocabulary that's explicit in our work. And I think that the past year, in part from Black Lives Matter and the election craziness and, you know, the pandemic, has really refocused a lot of attention on, you know, issues of equity, for example, diversity, inclusion, sort of, you know, what is it that we can do to actually make sure that we're putting our ethics and our values at the center of what we do. And everywhere I look, people in organizations and companies are refocusing on that. And I think that's really, really helpful. Dr. Chloe Schwenke, who's also a graduate of the School of Public Policy and one of David Crocker's former students as well, launched this past spring with help from Laurie Kelleher and I and Anna Malavisi, the Center for Values and International Development, which is a new organization meant to serve this purpose. And, you know, everywhere we go and talk to people, you know, all of these, you know, Beltway bandits are just like, yes, yes, we need a more vocabulary. Yes, we need to refocus on this. And that's exciting. And so I think that a lot of the things that made 2020 such a difficult year are also helping to create a future in which we recognize that we haven't had our attention always in the right place. So that makes me hopeful.